The Colophon at Turfan. There is a branch of the Indo-European family of languages that is named after the wrong people. It is not a small branch, and it is not a minor error. It sits in every handbook and every university syllabus and every historical atlas. And everyone who uses the name knows that it is wrong, and everyone goes on using it anyway. The name is Tocharian. The people it points to, the Tocharian of the Greek geographers, spoke a completely different language, from a completely different family, in a completely different place. And the reason we call it Tocharian is that in 1907, a German scholar read the last page of a Buddhist play, in a language nobody had ever seen before, in a script borrowed from a merchant people, written in ink on paper that had been sitting in the dry ruins of a Central Asian oasis for something like 1,000 years, and he made a reasonable inference from a single word. That word sat at the very end of the book, in the part that no reader ever reads. The Colophon, the place where the scribe writes down who translated the thing, and from what, and for whom, and asks for merit. The least literary part of a book, the bookkeeping, the small print. And it is the small print that reorganized an entire field. I want to spend some time in that oasis, and with the people who wrote that Colophon, because the story of how we came to know any of this is stranger and slower and more human than the tidy summary in the handbook. And because at the bottom of it, there is an argument that is still going on. Start with the place. The Turfan Depression is a basin in the eastern Tarim, in what is now Xinjiang, and it is one of the lowest places on the surface of the earth. The floor of it lies well below sea level, in a bowl ringed by mountains, and the effect of that geography is a climate of almost theatrical extremity. Summer temperatures are among the highest recorded anywhere in Asia. Rainfall is close to nothing. The wind moves fine sand across the flats and piles it against the ruins. It is a difficult place to live and a superb place to be dead, or, more precisely, a superb place for paper to be dead in. Organic material that would have rotted in a season almost anywhere else simply sits there, drying for century after century. Silk, wood, human skin, and above all paper. And Turfan had a very great deal of paper. It sat on the northern arm of the road system we lazily call the Silk Road, and it was a place where languages piled up. In the caves and the ruined monasteries and the collapsed temple libraries around the oasis, in places with names like Bezeklik and Sengim and Murdoch and Yarkoto and Kacho, there were the remains of a literate civilization that had been Buddhist and Manichaean and Christian in the Church of the East tradition, sometimes all within the same few square miles. Its books were written in more than 20 languages and in something like as many scripts. Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan, Sogdian, the trade language of the Central Asian merchant network, Middle Persian and Parthian, brought east by Manichaean missionaries, Bactrian, Cotonese and its relative Tumshukis, Syriac, Old Turkic, written sometimes in a runiform alphabet, sometimes in Brahmi, sometimes in the Manichaean script, and most often in a cursive alphabet that the Turks had taken over from the Sogdians. Mongolians later. And one more, which nobody in the modern world had ever read. The way that library came to Berlin is not a story anyone tells with much pride now, but it has to be told, because the shape of the evidence we have is entirely determined by the shape of that removal. Between 1902 and 1914, the Prussian state and its museums sent 4 expeditions to the Turfan region. The first left in the autumn of 1902, led by Albert Grunwedel, an Indologist and art historian, accompanied by Georg Huth and by a museum technician named Theodor Bardus. It was paid for in part by the arms manufacturer Friedrich Krupp, which tells you something about the way the enterprise was understood at the time. It came home with 46 crates. The second, in 1904, was led by Albert von Lecoq, with Bardus again, and this time the Kaiser himself put in 32,000 marks. It came home with 105 crates. The third, which overlapped Grunwedel and Lecoq uneasily, went further west, to Kucha and Kizil and Kumshara and Shortchuk, and came home with 118. The fourth, in 1913, brought back 156. Grunwedel and Lecoq did not agree about method, and the disagreement matters. Grunwedel was a documentarian by temperament. He wanted to draw the caves, to record where each painting sat in relation to the others, to understand the program of a wall before anyone touched it. Lecoq wanted the paintings. He believed, with some justification given what happened to those sites afterwards, that anything left in place would be destroyed by weather or by iconoclasm or by farmers quarrying the walls for fertilizer, and that removal to Berlin was rescue. Bardas, who had been a sailor before he was a museum man, turned out to have a startling gift for getting a fresco off a mud brick wall in one piece. He cut the paintings out. The great cycles of Bezeklik, the rows of donor figures, and the enormous scenes of the Buddha's previous lives were sawn into panels, packed in straw, and carried by cart and camel and rail to Berlin. The paintings are the part that people remember, but the paper is the part that changed scholarship. Something over 40,000 fragments of text came back in those crates. Most of them are small. Many are the size of a playing card or smaller, torn, worm-eaten, water-stained, burned at one edge. They had been swept into corners, buried in rubble, stuffed into the cavities of statues, thrown into pits. There was no such thing as an intact library. There was a vast confetti of a library, and the work of the 20th century, and now the 21st, has been to sort it. The material is split today between the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, which holds roughly 13,000 of the Iranian and Turkic fragments, and the State Library in Berlin, which holds most of the rest. Around 8,000 of the fragments are in Old Turkic, mostly from the 9th to the 14th centuries. The Academy's Turfan Studies project has been cataloging them for decades, in a series organized not by shelf position, but by content, so that pieces of the same work that were found in different places and accessioned under different numbers can finally be laid next to each other. Simon Christian Rashman's catalog of one single Buddhist text, the Old Uyghur Golden Light Sutra, runs to 3 volumes and describes something like 1,000 fragments. Jens Wilkins cataloged the Old Turkic Manichaean material in nearly 600 entries. The digital archive built between the late 1990s and the middle 2000s holds something like 28,000 images of 14,000 fragments, and the work continues under Abdurrashid Yaqub and a team of specialists who between them read all of those 20-odd languages. Not all of it survived the century. The Ethnological Museum in Berlin was bombed 7 times during the Second World War. The wall paintings that Bardas had sawn out of the caves had, on arrival, been cemented into the museum walls, which meant that, when the museum burned, they could not be moved, and 28 of the finest of them were destroyed outright. The smaller pieces did better, because smaller things can be hidden, and much of the manuscript material spent the war in bunkers and in coal mines. But at least 10 crates were taken from a bunker at the Berlin Zoo in 1945, and have not been seen since. There are Turfan texts somewhere that were dug out of a desert, carried 8,000 kilometers, catalogued, photographed in some cases, and then vanished a second time. Scholars occasionally cite them from pre-war photographs, which is a peculiar kind of citation, a reference to a thing that is known to exist only as an image of itself. Now to the language. In 1907, working on material from the second and third expeditions, Friedrich Wilhelm Karl Müller and Emil Sieg were confronting a set of manuscripts in Brahmi script, the Indian writing system, which was familiar, containing a language that was not. It was not Sanskrit. It was not Iranian. It was not Turkic or Chinese or Tibetan. When Sieg and his colleague Wilhelm Siegling published their announcement the following year, they had established something that ought to have been impossible on the map of the time. This was an Indo-European language, related to Latin and Greek and Sanskrit and German, spoken in the Tarim Basin, at the far eastern edge of the family's range, 1,000 kilometers past where anyone expected Indo-European to reach. It was strange in a specific technical way, too. Historical linguists had long divided the Indo-European languages into two rough groups by what they had done with a particular series of consonants inherited from the parent language, the sounds reconstructed as palatal stops. In one group, which includes Sanskrit and the Iranian languages and Balto-Slavic and Armenian, those sounds became sibilants, so that the word for 100 comes out with an S or a SH sound at the front. In the other, which includes Latin and Greek and Celtic and Germanic, they stayed as K sounds, so that the word for 100 is the Latin centum. The two groups were named after their words for 100, satum and centum, and the geography looked satisfyingly neat. Centum in the west, satum in the east. Tocharian is a centum language. Its word for 100 begins with a K, and it sits further east than any of the satum languages. The neat map broke, permanently, on a handful of manuscript scraps from a desert oasis, and the field has been adjusting to that ever since. The current understanding is that centum and satum were never a real east-west split at all, but two independent outcomes, and that the tidy old picture was an artifact of which languages happened to be known. Very quickly, it also became clear that there were two of them, not one. Two closely related but distinct languages, obviously sisters, obviously not mutually intelligible, which for want of anything better got called Tocharian A and Tocharian B. And here is where the naming problem enters, because Müller had already reached for a name, and the name came from a Colophon. The Colophon belonged to a work called, in the Old Turkic version, the Matrisimet. In the Tocharian version, it is the M-A-I-T-R-E-Y, a S-A-M-I-T-I-N-A macron letter 1E60 a K, which means something like the drama of the meeting with Maitreya. Maitreya is the Buddha of the future, the one who will appear when the teaching of the present Buddha has been forgotten, and this text is a long dramatic treatment of his career and of the moment when the faithful will meet him. It ran to 27 acts. In its Tocharian, a form it is written in the mixed style the Indian tradition calls champu, prose alternating with verse, and it carries stage directions, which is to say it was at least conceived as something that could be performed, not merely read. Fragments of 6 different manuscripts of it survive, 5 of them from the temple complex at Shorchuk and 1 from Kacho. None is complete. It is, on the evidence, the single most important literary work in Tocharian A, and we have it in pieces. The old Uyghur translation is better preserved, and it is rendered entirely into prose. Whoever made it declined to reproduce the alternation of verse and prose, which is itself a decision worth noticing, and to which I will come back. 4 manuscripts of it are known, from Turfan, from the oasis of Kamal, which is also called Hami, and 1 in the Japanese collection assembled by Count Atani Kazui. The Kamal manuscript carries a date corresponding to the year 1067, and it came to light in the middle of the 20th century, decades after the German crates were packed, and it is far more nearly complete than anything in Berlin. Its publication, through the long collaboration of Jeng Schimmen with Hans Joachim Klimkate and with Jens Peter Laut, gave the field for the first time a sustained continuous text rather than a mosaic. And the Colophon of the Matrisimet says, in essence, that a teacher named Aryakendra brought the work over from the Indian language into the language of the Tochari, and that a teacher named P.R. a J and tilde a macron R a K letter 1E63 IT brought it from the Tochari language into Turkic. 2 men, 3 languages, 1 relay. That is the whole of it. That is the sentence. Müller took the word in the middle, TW Gameri as it is written, Tochari as it is usually read, and connected it to a name known from the classical geographers. Ptolemy, in the 2nd century, mentions a people called the Tochari. The same name turns up in Indo-Iranian forms, as Tuxari and Tidavara and Tukara. The identification was not lazy. It was a perfectly sensible piece of philology, joining a Central Asian ethnonym in a Turkic text to a Central Asian ethnonym in a Greek one. And so the mysterious Indo-European language of the Tarim was baptized Tocharian. And Sieg and Siegling's announcement in 1908 called it, in the German of the day, the language of the Indo-Scythians. The trouble is that we now know a great deal about the Tochari, and what we know is that they did not speak this. The Tochari of the classical sources are, on the usual identification, the people the Chinese sources call the Yuezhi, who were pushed west out of the Gansu corridor in the 2nd century before the Common Era, moved into Bactria, and eventually produced the Kushan Empire. And we know what language the Kushans used, because they left inscriptions, and, more decisively, because a body of documents in that language surfaced in the late 20th century and was edited by Nicholas Sims Williams. It is Bactrian, an Eastern Iranian language, written in a modified Greek alphabet, a legacy of the Hellenistic kingdoms in the region. The Great Kushan inscription from Rabatak is in Bactrian. Whatever the Tochari were, they were Iranian-speaking, which places them in the Satem group, on the other side of that consonantal divide, in a different neighborhood of the family altogether. So the name is wrong. It points across the mountains, at the wrong people speaking the wrong language. The field has known this essentially since the 1920s, and it has been proposed more than once that we ought to stop. The most careful alternative comes from Bernard Sergeant, who suggested naming the 2 languages after the places they were actually used, and after what their speakers seem to have called themselves. Tocharian is associated with the oasis the Sanskrit sources call Agni, which the Chinese call Yankee and which is Karashar today, and its speakers appear to have used a self-designation that comes out as Arsi. Tocharian B belongs to Kucha, which appears as Kusi or Kuchi. So the proposal was Agni Kuchi, or in an earlier version Arsi Kuchi. Others simply write Agnian and Kuchian, and you will meet those terms in the literature. But the alternatives have never taken hold. A century of citation has too much inertia. To rename the languages now would be to make several thousand published articles marginally harder to find. And philology is a discipline with a long memory and a strong preference for continuity of reference. So everyone keeps writing Tocharian, and everyone keeps adding, in a footnote or a parenthesis, that the name is a misnomer, and the footnote has itself become a small genre. It is worth pausing on how much rides on this one word in one Colophon, because there is a live question underneath the naming. Suppose the Uyghur scribe who wrote Tochari meant exactly what Müller thought he meant, which is to say, suppose that the word was in fact the ordinary contemporary name for the people of Agni and Kucha and their language. Then the name is wrong only in the sense that the Uyghurs and the Greeks had somehow attached the same word to 2 different populations, which happens constantly in the history of ethnonyms and is not very interesting. But suppose instead that the word had a different reference in the 11th century than Müller assumed, that it named some other group entirely, or a region rather than a language, or a subset of speakers. Then the chain of the Colophon does not say what everyone has always taken it to say, and the one direct piece of evidence for the transmission route of this text, and by extension for the whole model of how Buddhist literature moved through the Tarim, becomes uncertain. The evidence is thin and contested, and cuts more than one way. There is a Sogdian text of around the 8th or 9th century that refers to the 4 TW Gamerk, the 4 Tugrak, apparently as a designation of a group in the region, which at least establishes that the word was in circulation as an ethnonym before the Uyghurs arrived in force, and that it was used by outsiders, not only by the Turks. Whether it maps neatly onto speakers of one Tocharian language or the other, or onto both, or onto something else again, is exactly the point at issue. Which brings up the second, larger argument, and this one is genuinely unsettled. The two Tocharian languages do not appear in the same kinds of documents. Tocharian B turns up everywhere and in everything. It is found across the region, in monastery account books, in caravan passes that record travelers moving through checkpoints, in medical and magical texts, in letters, in a famous fragment of a love poem, in graffiti. It is the language of daily administrative life in Kucha, and well beyond it. Tocharian A, by contrast, is found only in the east, around Karashar and Turfan and Shortchuk, and only in religious texts. No accounts, no passes, no love poems, nothing but Buddhist literature. The natural reading of that distribution, and it is the majority reading, associated in particular with the work of Michael Peyrot, is that by the time our manuscripts were written Tocharian, it was no longer anybody's mother tongue. It had become a liturgical language, learned in monasteries, used for scripture, and for the composition of religious works, the way Latin was used in early modern Europe or Sanskrit in India, while ordinary speech in the region had shifted to Tocharian B and then to Turkic. On this reading, the Tocharian manuscripts we have are the product of a scholastic culture, keeping a dead language alive on purpose. The counterargument, which has been pressed recently and at length, says that this reads too much into a distribution that may simply reflect what was preserved and where. Its proponents point to radiocarbon dates on Tocharian, manuscripts that place them as late as the 10th and early 11th centuries. Well past the period when the language is supposed to have died. They point out that translating a work of the scale and literary difficulty of the M, a ITREY, a S, a MIT, IN, a macron, letter 1E60, a K out of Tocharian, and into Old Uyghur is not a thing a community of second language learners does easily, and that the most economical explanation for a good translation is the presence of good speakers. And they offer an account of the apparent disappearance, which is worth sitting with. Call it a shadow effect. When the Tibetan Empire took the Tarim around the year 790, and later when the Uyghurs established themselves, political and economic and religious authority passed to people who wrote in other scripts and other languages. Monastic patronage moved. Administrative record-keeping moved. A language can stop being written without stopping being spoken, and a language that stops being written stops being visible to us entirely. The silence in the record is a silence about writing, not necessarily about speech. I find that a genuinely difficult argument to weigh, and I do not think the question is closed. What I notice about it is that both sides are reasoning from an absence, and absences in this material are cheap. We are looking at what happened to survive in a handful of dry caves within a few days' ride of one oasis, after 1,000 years, 2 waves of iconoclasm, 1 set of European expeditions, and 7 bombing raids. Almost everything that was ever written in these languages is gone. The question of what the silence means is, in a strict sense, a question about a sample of unknown and probably unknowable bias. Let me turn to the other end of the relay, because the people who made the old Uyghur translations are, if anything, more interesting than the language they translated out of, and they are the reason we have any of this. The Uyghurs come into the Tarim as refugees. Through the 8th century, they had run a steppe empire from the Orkhon Valley in Mongolia, powerful enough to have intervened decisively in the Tang dynasty's civil wars. And in the 760s, one of their rulers adopted Manichaeism as the religion of the court. This is a remarkable fact on its own. Manichaeism, the dualist religion founded by Mani in 3rd century Mesopotamia, persecuted almost everywhere it went, from Rome to Persia to China, became the state religion of a Central Asian empire. and Manichaean texts in Middle Persian and Parthian and Sogdian and Turkic are among the treasures of the Turfan collection, precisely because of that patronage. Almost everything we know firsthand about Manichaean scripture, as opposed to what its enemies said about it, comes from these fragments. Then, in the year 840, the Kyrgyz destroyed the Uyghur Khaganate, and the Uyghurs scattered. One group moved south and west into the Turfan Basin and the Tarim oases, and established a kingdom centered on Kacho that lasted, in one form or another, for something over 350 years, until it became a Mongol vassal in the early 13th century. And in that kingdom, something happened that is very hard to get an outsider to find interesting, and which is one of the great cultural events of medieval Asia. The Uyghurs, having arrived as Manichaeans into a landscape that was overwhelmingly Buddhist, gradually became Buddhists themselves, and then set about translating the entire literature into their own language. Not summarizing it, not adapting it, translating it at scale over generations from every source language available to them. From Chinese, from Sanskrit, from Tocharian, from Sogdian, and later, in the Mongol period, into and out of Tibetan. The exact chronology of that conversion is itself an argued question, and the older picture of a clean switch has softened into something messier, with Manichaean and Buddhist and Christian communities coexisting in the same towns for a long time. We know some of the translators by name because they sign their work in the Colophons, which is the habit that saves everything. The most celebrated is a man whose name is written Shinko Sheli Tutun, which is a Turkic rendering of a Chinese title and a Sanskrit-derived honorific stacked together, itself a small monument to the multilingualism of the place. He came from Beshbalik, north of the Tianshan, and he worked around the turn of the first millennium. He translated the Golden Light Sutra out of Chinese into Old Uyghur under the title Altan Yaruk, the Golden Brightness, and it became the central scripture of Uyghur Buddhism, copied and recopied for centuries. He translated the sutra, known as the Eightfold Radiance. He worked on the Uyghur version of the biography of Xuanzang, the 7th century Chinese pilgrim who walked to India and back and brought home the texts that reshaped East Asian Buddhism, which means we have a Turkic account of a Chinese monk's journey to India, produced in a desert oasis 3 centuries after the fact, and it survives while parts of other versions do not. He knew Sanskrit, and it appears Tocharian. He did not translate mechanically. Scholars who have compared his Uyghur against his Chinese originals find that where the source has Chinese verse, he does not attempt to reproduce its form, but writes new verse in the Turkic manner, using alliteration, which is what Turkic poetry does, rather than the parallelism and tonal patterning of Chinese, which Turkic cannot do. He was working, in other words, with a theory of translation. Klaus Rerhaborn argued, on the evidence of his titles and his working method, that he may have functioned as the Chinese-trained head of a workshop of Uyghur translators, rather than as a solitary scholar, which would make these texts institutional products, the output of a scriptorium with a division of labor. And the fullest manuscript of his Golden Light Sutra was not found at Turfan at all. It was found in Gansu, far to the east, in a temple, by the Russian Turkologist Sergei Malov early in the 20th century, and it had been copied in the year 1687. Sit with that for a moment. A translation made from Chinese into Old Uyghur around the year 1000, still being copied by hand in a Buddhist community 687 years later, in a language that had by then long ceased to be the ordinary speech of the people using it, and recovered by a European philologist within living memory. The transmission chain does not stop when the empire stops. The mechanics of that translation culture are visible in the physical books, and the physical books are full of fossils. Consider the format. Indian Buddhist manuscripts were written on palm leaves, long narrow rectangles, stacked and bound by a cord threaded through a hole in the middle of each leaf, and knotted at the ends. This is the Pathai format, and it is a sensible design for palm leaf, which is stiff and comes in strips. Central Asia had no palm trees. Central Asia had paper, which came from China, and paper can be made in any shape you like, and does not need a cord to hold it, since you can simply stack or fold or roll it. And yet a great many Central Asian Buddhist manuscripts on paper are cut into long, narrow rectangles imitating palm leaves, and a great many of them have a hole punched through the middle, or, more touchingly, a circle drawn where the hole would be decorated, serving no function at all. The book remembers a plant that does not grow there. The form outlives the reason for the form. Or consider the script. The alphabet in which most of these Uyghur texts are written descends from Aramaic, the administrative language of the Persian Empire, by way of Sogdian, the language of the merchants who ran the Central Asian trade. The Turks took it from the Sogdians. Then, in the early 13th century, when the Mongols needed a writing system, they took it from the Uyghurs. The traditional story names a captured Uyghur scribe, Taratanga, as the man who taught the Mongols to write. And later the Manchus took it from the Mongols and used it to administer China until the 20th century. A script that began as a way of writing a Semitic language in Persian chanceries ended up as the official hand of the Qing dynasty. And it made that journey by being borrowed, each time, by a people who had just acquired an empire and needed clerks. All of which is to say that the Uyghurs of Kacho were not passive recipients of anybody's culture. They were a hinge. Material came into their language from Chinese and Sanskrit and Tocharian and Sogdian, and went out of it into Mongolian. And the reason we can reconstruct so much of what was in between is that they were meticulous about saying where things came from. That is why the Colophon matters so much, and why it is worth understanding what a Colophon is for. It is not, primarily, a bibliographic note. It is a religious act. The merit generated by producing a sacred text has to be assigned to someone, dedicated to the welfare of a patron or a parent or all sentient beings, and that assignment has to be written down. So the scribe records the circumstances. Who paid, who translated from what, when, in which reign, in which monastery. The record-keeping is a side effect of the theology of merit. Nobody wrote Tochari into the end of the matrisimate in order to inform a German philologist about the history of Indo-European. They wrote it because you have to say what you did in order for it to count. And so an entire branch of the family tree of half the world's languages carries a name that is a fossil of somebody else's bookkeeping, mistransferred. There is one more layer here that has arrived recently, and that complicates the picture in a way I find clarifying rather than confusing. In 2021, a large genomic study of the Bronze Age human remains from the Tarim Basin was published. The naturally mummified bodies from Zio and related sites that had generated a century of speculation, precisely because they looked, to European eyes, unexpectedly Western, and because they sat in the same basin as the Tocharian manuscripts and were therefore constantly conscripted as the Tocharians' ancestors. The genomes came back, and they did not show a population that had migrated in from the western steppe. They showed a highly isolated local population, descended in large part from an ancient northern Eurasian lineage that had been in the region a very long time, with remarkably little admixture from anywhere. But the same people were culturally cosmopolitan. They herded cattle and made cheese. They grew wheat and millet, crops that came from opposite ends of Eurasia. They buried their dead in a way that borrowed from several directions. So here is a population that was genetically about as isolated as a population can be, and culturally about as connected as a population can be, sitting in the same basin where, 2,000 years later, monks would be translating Indian drama out of an Indo-European language into a Turkic one using an alphabet from Syria. The Bronze Age mummies are not the Tocharians, And the honest position is that we do not know how the Tocharian languages arrived in the Tarim or when. What the genetic result does is sever, cleanly and publicly, the assumption that a language travels inside a bloodline. Languages move by being taught. Scripts move by being borrowed. Texts move by being translated. And every one of those movements is an act performed by people, in a room, for reasons of their own, most of which we will never recover. Which is what the field is left holding, and which is, I think, the thing worth taking to sleep. Jens Wilkins published, in 2021, a dictionary of Old Uyghur. It runs to more than 900 pages, and the Göttingen Academy put it out where anyone can read it without paying. Every entry in it was built up out of those fragments. A word attested here on a torn corner, there in a burned line, somewhere else in a photograph of something that no longer exists. The Vienna project, that is assembling a comprehensive edition of the Tocharian manuscripts, works the same way, joining scrap to scrap. And the joins are sometimes made between pieces held in different countries by scholars who identify them from digital images. A century and a bit of extremely patient labor has turned a desert's worth of torn paper into 2 grammars, several dictionaries, and a serious literature. And the name at the top of all of it is a mistake, made in good faith, in 1907, on the basis of a word written by a monk who was doing his accounts. I do not think that is an embarrassment. I think it is the most accurate possible summary of what this material is. The Turfan documents are not a window onto a culture. They are a record of transfer. Everything in them arrived from somewhere else and left for somewhere else. The religion from India by way of China and Sogdiana, the script from Aramaic by way of Sogdian, the paper from China, the drama from Sanskrit into Tocharian into Turkic, the alphabet onward to the Mongols and the Manchus. Nothing in that library is native to it. What is native to it is the practice of handing things on, and of writing down, at the end, who handed what to whom. The name Tocharian is what happens when that record of handing on is itself handed on, one link further than it was meant to go, into a language and a century its writer could not have imagined, where it lands slightly askew and stays. Which is what always happens. Which is, in the end, the only mechanism by which anything reaches us at all. The last act of the M, a I-T-R-E-Y, a S, a M-I-T, I-N-A macron, letter 1E60, a K, in the Tocharian, concerns the moment when the Buddha of the future finally appears, after an unimaginable stretch of time, to people who have spent that whole time waiting on a promise made in a text. It is a story about transmission across a gap so long that nobody who starts the waiting can finish it. The monks at Shorchuk performed it, or read it aloud, in a language that was already old. The Uyghurs translated it into prose, and let the verses go, and wrote their names at the end. The wind moved the sand over the ruins. The paper stayed dry. And 1,000 years later, somebody picked up the last page first.